In every corner of Africa, stories breathe, tales buried in dust, whispered through firelight. You're about to hear one of them. Welcome to African Horror Stories. Senegalese folklore, the Kumpo. Amado Doué, a 25-year-old student from Dakar who has returned to his ancestral village, Badiara, near the Casamance border, to complete his university thesis on the modernization of Senegalese village life. He finds the slow, quiet rhythm stifling. Amado hated the quiet, not the natural quiet of the mango groves or the low, rhythmic crash of the nearby Atlantic tide, but the expectant, pressurized silence that clung to his grandmother's house in Badiara. It felt heavy, like a threat. He was sitting on the stoop, sweat dripping from his chin onto his laptop keyboard. He needed data for his thesis, evidence of Badiara's progression, but the Wi-Fi signal was weak and the village elders refused to let him record their interviews. "You capture the soul with that machine, Amadou," his grandfather Elder Bey had told him, his voice dry and final. "The things of the village belong to the village." Amadou sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at the satellite coordinates on his screen. Just outside the main village, nestled in a particularly dense patch of raffia palm, was the perfect spot for his portable weather monitor, a high point that promised better cellular reception. The spot was known as the Toll of the Ancestors, where no one was supposed to speak or shout. Superstition, he scoffed. He slung his worn backpack over his shoulder, the tripod bumping against his hip. He needed to make a video call to his supervisor in Dakar tonight. He needed the signal. As he walked toward the toll, the air temperature dropped noticeably. The village chatter, the clinking of pots, the distant laughter of children seemed to drop out entirely, replaced by a dull, constant hum, like electricity passing through damp earth. He reached the center of the clearing. It was unnaturally smooth, and even the insects were silent. Amadou quickly assembled the tripod and clipped his new smartphone into the holder. He opened the video app, connected to the internet, and then, without thinking, he muttered aloud in frustration at the slow connection. "Japma, why is everything so slow out here?" The minute the words left his lips, the hum stopped. The quiet that descended was not natural. It was the absence of sound, the cessation of all life around him. Amado felt the tiny hairs on his neck stand up. He glanced quickly into the thicket of shredded raffia palms ringing the clearing. He saw nothing. He was about to laugh off the tension when he heard it, a sound like dry leaves being dragged across granite, followed by a single, low whistle that seemed to vibrate inside his skull. The whistle died away, swallowed by the immense quiet. Amadou froze in his hand, hovering over the call button on his phone. He turned slowly toward the thicket of raffia palms, his heart hammering against his ribs. At first, he saw only the dense, gray-green screen of dried fronds. Then he saw the figure. It didn't emerge, it was simply there. Standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing where the shadows were darkest was a towering figure completely encased in dried, shredded raffia leaves. It was an amorphous mass of rustling, straw-like material, roughly the size and shape of a very large man, but with no head, no neck, and no visible hands or feet. It looked like a walking haystack. This was the Kumpo. It made no sound now, yet Amadou felt an intense, agonizing pressure in his eardrums, as if the air itself were being sucked out of the clearing. He knew what it was, but seeing the legendary figure not dancing at a festival, but standing motionless in the forbidden toll, was profoundly different. It was terrifyingly real. The creature's raffia cloak, hundreds of individual strips of leaf, began to shudder slightly, creating a soft, dry rasping sound that was worse than a scream. Amadou realized the shivering wasn't the wind. The Kumpo was focusing its entire attention on him. He glanced down at his phone, still mounted on the tripod, displaying the word mute on the screen. He had broken the silence. He had spoken, and worse, he had brought the noise of the modern world, the signal, the screen, the potential for distant voices, into the sacred quiet. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the smooth earth. The creature finally moved. It didn't walk, it glided. With one impossibly smooth motion, it covered half the distance to Amadou. Then it raised the stick it held, a heavy, garnered piece of dark wood. It didn't point the stick. Instead, it used the stick to slowly, deliberately touch the ground directly between the Kumpo and Amadou. The touch was completely silent, yet the ground immediately in front of Amadou cracked, a hairline fissure snaking from the point of impact toward his sneakers. The message was clear: silence. The silent splintering fissure in the ground was all the warning Amadou needed. The Kumpo wasn't an exhibition or a dancer. It was a physical manifestation of judgment. He didn't waste time thinking or apologizing. Instinct took over. He spun around, leaving the tripod, phone, and thesis data behind, and sprinted back toward the relative safety of the village. His terror lent him speed. He burst from the clearing, plunging into the winding, dusty path that led back to his grandmother's compound. He risked one glance over his shoulder. The Kumpo was now moving with shocking speed. It wasn't running. The raffia creature seemed to float an inch above the dry ground, but it was gaining. Its movement was too fluid, too effortless for a creature made of straw and sticks. The only sound it made was the faint, dry rasping hiss of the raffia leaves trailing against the path. Amadou ducked under a low-hanging branch, his breath ragged and hot in his throat. "It can't follow me back to the houses," he thought desperately. But the Kumpo seemed unbound by geography. It followed the path precisely, its relentless silent pursuit ignoring every obstacle. As Amadou rounded a bend, he reached the edge of a small groundnut field, separating him from the first few village huts. He threw himself into a reckless sprint across the cultivated earth, kicking up dusty clouds of red soil. Just as he reached the thin barbed wire marking the field's boundary, the silent creature executed a terrifying action. It didn't step over the fence. The Kumpo unfolded. The towering raffia figure suddenly sank at the waist, its top half snapping forward toward the ground, moving like a grotesque hinge. The raffia leaves became a blurred, horizontal mass, allowing the spirit to slide under the barbed wire and across the groundnut field faster than Amadou could run. It was impossibly quick and utterly silent. Amadou screamed, but the sound caught in his throat. The surrounding pressurized quiet was smothering his voice. He scrambled past the wire and threw himself into the doorway of the nearest structure, a small storage shed belonging to his aunt. He slammed the thin wooden door shut and fumbled for the latch. On the other side of the door, the dry hissing rasp stopped. Amadou leaned against the wood, gasping. "It's here, right outside." Then he heard a new sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't loud, but it was incredibly heavy. It sounded exactly like the thick, blunt end of a wooden stick tapping the dirt right where his feet had landed outside the door. 1 tap, 2 taps, 3 taps. The Kumpo was counting his last steps.
Amadou pressed his ear against the thin door, listening to the methodical, heavy thump, thump, thump of the Kumpo's stick. The rhythmic tapping was a metronome counting down his survival. He didn't need to look to know the stick wasn't trying to smash the wood. It was laying down a perimeter, marking the space where the transgression, the broken silence, had ended. Then the thumping stopped. The absolute quiet returned, thicker now, pressing against the corrugated iron roof of the shed. Amadou could hear his own heartbeat sounding like a drum against his ribs. Suddenly, the air inside the small windowless shed became incredibly heavy. It felt less like a lack of air and more like being submerged in water. A terrible physical pressure began to build against his eardrums, radiating into his skull. Amadou staggered back. He looked around the shed, searching for an exit or a weapon, but the only items were sacks of dried ground nuts and a few dusty shovels. The pressure intensified. It wasn't the sound that was terrifying, it was the enforcement of silence. The atmosphere itself was crushing any possibility of sound. A low, agonizing ache began in his jaw, spreading as the pressure sought to stop any possible articulation, any shout, cry, or gasp. His aunt's corrugated iron roof began to creak, not from heat, but from the invisible force bearing down on it. The metal buckled slightly inward. The wooden doorframe groaned. Amadou sank to his knees, gripping his head as if he could hold his skull together. He realized the Kumpo wasn't trying to break the structure. It was trying to break him. It was enforcing the sacred taboo of silence with sheer, crushing, supernatural weight. He looked down at his hand. Capillaries beneath his skin had begun to burst, tiny crimson spiderwebs appearing on his knuckles from the sheer internal pressure. If he didn't leave, his lungs would collapse, not from lack of oxygen, but from the impossibility of expansion in this silent, pressurized void. He had to make a sound. He had to scream, but the air was solidifying in his throat. With a final, desperate burst of strength, he hurled himself at the door, pulling the latch and throwing the weak wood open. He stumbled out onto the dry earth, gasping for the normal air, the pain immediately subsiding into a throbbing headache. The ground was clear. The Kumpo was standing 10 feet away, motionless, its raffia cloak shimmering slightly in the hot sun. It had not moved. It simply waited for its pressure to do its work. The silent enforcer raised its stick again. This time, it didn't tap the ground. It began to draw a perfectly straight line in the dust, leading directly away from the shed and toward the dense mango groves, the darkest part of the ancestral land. The Kumpo was not just punishing him, it was directing him. The silent straight line drawn in the dust by the Kumpo's stick was a terrifying invitation. Amadou understood instantly. This wasn't an escape route, it was a command. The Kumpo wasn't satisfied with silencing him. It was directing him to a final specific act of atonement in the deepest part of the ancestral land. The raffia-clad figure didn't move, yet Amadou felt an invisible force pushing him forward along the track it had drawn. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking, his mind screaming a silent rejection. The line led him deep into the sacred grove, a dense, old section of the forest where the most ancient village taboos were enforced. Here, the trees were immense, blocking out the sun, and the air was perpetually cool and damp. After what felt like miles, the path opened up into a small, dark clearing. In the center sat an object that froze the blood in Amadou's veins. His laptop. It was placed deliberately on top of a low, flat stone, an ancestral altar of sacrifice. The screen was cracked, but it still glowed, displaying the last image it held. Amadou's half-written thesis detailing the modernization of Badiara. Standing beside the laptop was a perfectly preserved object that had no business being there. The iron reliquary that Elias and Jane had unearthed in the distant Ethiopian church years ago. It was dark, heavy, and the metal was cold to the touch. The Kumpo glided into the clearing behind him, stopping the silent pursuit. It raised its stick a final time, pointing it first at Amadou, and then at the reliquary, and finally at the laptop. Amadou felt the demand enter his mind like a shard of ice. Choose the burden. He was being forced to choose between the instruments of the modern, noisy, and unspiritual world, the laptop representing the knowledge he prized, and the horrifying, cursed relic of true spiritual power, the reliquary holding the Dask's calcified eye. The Kumpo communicated its final, chilling directive, not with a sound, but with an overwhelming, silent clarity. One of these must remain, and one must be carried away, permanently, silently. Amadou knew the choice was not about which item to destroy, but which item he was condemned to carry forever, representing the source of the noise he brought into the sacred silence. If he chose the laptop, the ancient curse in the reliquary would remain in the grove, contaminating his ancestral home forever. If he chose the reliquary, he would be forced to carry the monstrous, silent curse with him back into the modern world, becoming its unseen guardian and its first subject. Sweat poured down his face. He reached out a trembling hand towards the cold, ancient iron. He knew the Dask's eye was the true source of all unforgivable noise. He reached for the reliquary. As his fingers closed around the cursed iron, the Kumpo gave a final, triumphant signal. Its raffia cloak began to shudder and spin violently, and the air filled with the deafening, dry sound of 1,000 dying whispers, the voices of every ancestor it protected. Amadou closed his eyes, accepting his silent, cursed burden.
That's all for today. If you liked the video, let me know by hitting like. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe for more. You can watch another video of mine right here. See you next time.